Thank you again for joining us this morning. Also today, just remember to use the chat box instead of the Q&A, what we've been doing in the past. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock, so thank you for joining us, everybody. And I'm going to hand this over to Barbara and to Kathy. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. So, and then I'll be here in the background if you need me, ladies. So.
Okie dokie. Thank you so much. We're delighted to be here, and I want to thank the Larkspur Library for having us. I'm Kathy Hunting, and Barbara Robertson is also here with us. We're doing this tag team. Barbara's actually the primary author of this talk, and she's going to be monitoring the chat, and she'll respond to some questions that are more straightforward. She'll just directly respond to those in the chat. And for questions that need just a little bit more discussion, we'll handle those as we go. So feel free to type questions into the chat as we go. The first thing that I want to know is, who are Marin Master Gardeners? Probably a few of you are Master Gardeners, and others of you may have come to our programs before, so you're familiar with us.
So
but for those,
let me launch that poll too, because that will give us who's here. So
great. Master Gardeners are volunteers for the University of California Cooperative Extension, and we undergo a rather extensive training program in order to prepare us to educate the public in Marin about home horticulture, best practices in pest management, and sustainable landscaping. And as you can see from the photo, we educate a variety of ages, all the way from kids, like this photo shows, to adults, and those of you who are attending today. So with that, I want to take it away. Okay, and here comes the first. Okay, my PowerPoint is frozen, so I'm gonna momentarily stop my share, and I'm gonna come back in and see if we can't get my PowerPoint. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to try once more to share my screen, and hopefully it will go more smoothly. Sorry about that blip. Okay. So today's topic is climate smart gardening. And the first part of the talk focuses on the environmental impacts of climate change. And this is, if you pay attention to the science on climate change, which probably many of you may, you know that this is a pretty overwhelming topic, particularly when we think about the global impacts of climate change. And so to make this manageable for today, we have focused on 4 climate change environmental impacts that are most relevant to home gardeners. And those are shown on this slide, and I'm going to talk through those one at a time. And the first one, and the one we think most about when we think about global warming, it says it in the word global warming, is the impact of increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere on our surface temperatures on the Earth. And surface temperatures are rising. The average low temperatures are rising, the average high temperatures are rising, and we're seeing more heat waves. We have, in Marin, we're lucky enough to be moderated by the impact of the Pacific coast on our weather, which makes our weather usually quite pleasant. But in the past century, we're seeing about a third less fog than 100 years ago. And that has a really significant impact on precipitation, but also on moderating our temperatures. So the impacts of rising temperatures to think about for the garden is that most plants go into dormancy during the winter. And when they don't get adequate cooling in the winter, that doesn't prepare them as well for vigorous growth in the springtime. So that's one potential impact of temperature increase. Another one, for those of you who have fruit trees or nut trees in your yards, is that many trees, many fruit and nut trees, need chill hours. They need a certain amount of cold in the winter in order to produce a reliable crop the next spring. And so our chill periods are decreasing. We have the potential, when we get gorgeous, sunny, warm, weeks of weather in January, for the plants to think it's spring and to break their dormancy and leaf out, only to be blasted by frosts that come, as they normally do, throughout the rest of the spring. So that's a potential impact. And then finally, rising temperatures, particularly in kind of July through September, or even early October, can stress out, the plants get stressed by the heat and can get sunburned. Let me show you some of the data on rising low temperatures. These charts are produced by a pretty cool climate mapping tool called Climate Toolbox. And the website there is at the bottom of the page. And what this shows is, these are the US Department of Agriculture hardiness zones. And you've probably seen hardiness zones on plant tags and in plant catalogs, when it says this plant is hardy or able to withstand cold temperatures down to a certain range in the wintertime. And in Marin, we're typically in zone 10 or zone 9. And what you see here is, here's where the most frost-free areas are in Marin, along the coasts. And as we move inland, it tends to be a little chillier in the winter. And what we see here is, with future scenario of global warming, that frost-free area and warmer low winter temperatures are getting more widespread within Marin. And this scenario here is assuming that we control greenhouse gas emissions. This scenario over here on the far right of the screen is if we do a worse job of controlling greenhouse emissions. So this is one impact, is that we're going to have less frost in the winter. Another impact, and this is one we're all probably pretty well tuned in, is what's happening with our average high temperatures. And this is Marin County wide. This comes from another graphing tool, a climate graphing tool here, caladapt.org. And here's where we are on average across Marin County in 2021. And over the next 30 years or so, the best climate modeling predicts that we're going to see a rise in temperature of around 2 degrees or so. And the degree of that rise in temperature depends on how well we control our greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that those models diverge a lot, really substantially, into the latter half of this century, depending on how well we control our emissions. So that's rising high temperatures. And then this chart shows the number of extreme heat days on average that are predicted for Marin County. And this, of course, is gonna depend on where you live. If you're in Novato versus closer to the shore, in a cooler place like Mill Valley. But this is the predicted number of days where the maximum temperature exceeds 94 degrees. And for the baseline on this chart, it was only 4 times a year between 1980 and 2005. And now it's more like 9 times a year, 9 or 10 times a year. And that varies by year and by location, as I said. And as we move on further into the latter part of this century, the number of extreme heat days are going to get even more. And how many of you remember thinking back to Labor Day weekend last year in 2020, when we had an extreme heat wave, lasted, I don't remember, maybe 4 days, and it was sweltering, but in our garden, you could see very evident impacts of the extreme heat. Tomatoes look cooked, flowers withered. And then physiologically for plants, other things happen behind the scenes in plants. Plants really shut down physiologically, many plants, when the temperature gets quite hot. So in the future, with accelerating climate change, we're going to see more heat waves and more, and they'll be more intense as we go. So let me move on to precipitation. The climate scientists don't expect that our average precipitation around the San Francisco Bay Area is going to change very much. But what they say is that we're going to be having more erratic precipitation from year to year. And so that means more drought years and also more years where we have extreme precipitation. We have these large atmospheric river winter storms that can do a lot of damage. And so if you think about these storms and what happens, low-lying areas get inundated, waterways get overwhelmed, and can flood areas both along our bay shore and areas along our ocean, our Pacific shore. And of course, sea level rise coming on top of those storms means that flooding can be worse. When we have these extreme storms with runoff, they can erode the land, erode the soil and dead soil structure. They can cause mudslides. And some of you might recognize this photo on the right from Larkspur, which flooded. And I don't remember if this photo was from 2017 or 2019, but that is local for you guys. So on the opposite extreme, we're going to have more frequent droughts. And you all remember, those of you who lived here earlier, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, we had a 5-year drought from 2012 to 2016 that was pretty much the most severe on record. We've had record low rainfall this year, and we're in the 2nd year of another drought in our region and across California. And so what that means is that drought conditions bringing less rainfall to our reservoirs and less snowpack to the Sierra are exacerbating, I should say, the impact of higher temperatures are exacerbating the lack of rain and moisture. And what this means is that we're going to have deeper droughts because of rising temperatures, even regardless of what happens to our average rainfall. The other thing that happens with drought is it dries out the moisture in the soil and in the plants even more quickly than we normally see in our kind of winter wet, summer dry Mediterranean climate. And so when the soil and the plants are drying out more quickly, it leaves us with a long season in midsummer to well into the fall when we're at extreme wildfire risk. And We're all aware of that. This is a very evident impact of climate change. The third environmental impact of climate change that's relevant for us as gardeners is that our vegetation is getting out of sync with our climate. So our climate is gradually favoring more drought-tolerant plants. In addition to changes in vegetation, our pollinators are becoming out of sync with our flowering plants that need them to pollinate. Beneficial insects, their hatching times and life cycles may be out of sync with the damaging pests that they normally control. And another thing that's happening in the ecosystem outside of our backyards and front yards is that invasive plants have some natural advantages when the climate is changing. And so invasives are becoming more able to adapt in the face of climate change, and native plants are being threatened by invasives. Marin County might become less suitable for our kind of iconic evergreen forests. And also think about, as plants and insects, their ecology changes, the ecology of the whole wildlife that depends on those plants and insects is also changing with our global warming. The fourth environmental impact of climate change is that our soil is being impaired by the changing climate, by the changes I've described in temperature, increasing temperature, and erratic rainfall. And that is impairing the soil structure, the living communities of microorganisms that live in our soil and that actually make our soil healthy. And with that, the ability for the soil to provide nutrients to our plants, to our gardens. And increased temperatures, as I mentioned before, are going to be making our summer soil drier. And what that also means is that we're losing more carbon from our soil, or we have the potential to lose more carbon from our soil if we don't take steps to protect our soil. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and see if there are any questions that have come in that we should talk about.
No questions so far.
Okay, good. So what I want to say here is this is the pretty gloom and doom part of the talk, and now we're going to have an attitude adjustment and talk about what we can do to ameliorate the situation. So we're going to be talking about climate change mitigation in the garden. And so let me first define what we mean by mitigation in the context of climate change. What mitigation means is any kinds of measures that draw down carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere by storing those gases as chemically transformed gases, by storing them somewhere like in soil or in plants, or by reducing the amount of greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere in the first place. So that's mitigation. And the good news is that as gardeners, there are best practices we can adopt that help reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so by participating in this process, we can each do our own, like, really little itty bitty part to help decrease climate change. And I'm going to talk about 5 different strategies that are listed here. And we're going to go through these one at a time. And so we're going to start with farming carbon. And so there are two approaches to farming carbon that I'm going to mention. And one is by focusing on the soil and productivity, and another is by focusing on planting trees and shrubs. But before I get into that, what I want to do for you is briefly take you back to, 10th grade biology or something like this, and talk just briefly about the carbon cycle. Plants have this kind of magic capability to use sunlight to take carbon dioxide out of the air and convert it to plant tissues. This is photosynthesis, and this is the way that plants store carbon. Eventually, plants break down. They decompose. Their above ground parts can decompose, and their underground parts can either stay vital, or they can decompose too. Animals like this kangaroo rat that's shown also contribute organic matter to this carbon matter to the soil, and the soil can emit that carbon matter back up into the atmosphere, thus completing the cycle, making it available for plants to take back down. So that's the carbon cycle, and plants just play the central role in that. So healthy plants are part of the key to taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So what do we mean by farming carbon? Well, the thing that you need to know is that soil holds on to carbon in the form of organic matter. Soil also stores moisture, stores water. And so by holding on to the carbon, as I described, this is what reduces greenhouse gas emissions. There's a couple of really cool things about this. And one of those is that the more productive the soil is, that is, the more plant material that the land is supporting, the more carbon the soil can hold. And this makes a very cool cycle, because the more productive the soil is, the more carbon it can store. That is, the more plants that are on it, the more carbon it can store, and the more moisture it can hold. And when there's more organic matter or carbon in the soil and more moisture in the soil, the more productive the soil can be. So it's circular. Soil productivity with enhanced carbon content enhances moisture holding ability, which enhances the ability for the soil to support more plant life. So that's pretty, I don't know, I keep saying cool, and that's just because it just is, I don't know, some of us get excited about stuff like that. What can I say? Some strategies to keep more carbon in the soil. Number one is keep applying organic matter to the soil. Compost, compost, compost. So the more you kind of work on your soil, build up its organic content by digging in a little compost or leaving a little compost as a layer on the top, the more healthy your soil is going to be as it incorporates that organic matter. You might have heard of no-till agriculture. And as master gardeners, we also promote a no-till approach to home gardening. And that is that we want to leave the soil as undisturbed as we can. We don't want to dig it up with a rototiller, in between planting things. We want to keep the soil structure as intact as we can, to leave the carbon that's in the soil undisturbed, so it doesn't get emitted back into the atmosphere. And we want to try to keep our soil covered with plants or covered with mulch, because bare soil is vulnerable to erosion. And when soil erodes, its structure is impaired, carbon is lost, moisture is lost. And when we have severe atmospheric river rainstorms, which we know we're going to have in the face of a changing climate, we have more potential for mudslides. So we need plants to hold the soil and prevent erosion. So kind of in summary from this slide, soil is one of the most important keys to locking up carbon. It's a carbon, what we call a carbon sink. Another way of farming carbon is by keeping plants growing on the soil. Because as I said, all plants store carbon in their tissues above ground and in their root systems below ground. And plants help the soil store carbon as well. The bigger the plant, the more carbon it stores. And so this is why you see an emphasis, say you buy an airline ticket. Once you can kind of feel comfortable flying again, you buy an airline ticket and they offer you the option to offset the emissions from your flight by having trees planted somewhere in the world. The reason we focus on trees for kind of farming carbon is because the bigger the plant, the more carbon it stores. And that's why the emphasis on tree planting. And one interesting statistic here is that one mature tree can absorb more than 48 pounds of CO2 from the atmosphere every year. So that's important. And the faster growing the trees are, the more CO2 they accumulate. Another thing that trees can do in the context of climate change is they can provide us with shade and windbreaks. And so if you site your tree appropriately, it can provide you with a cooling effect. Say you want to site it so that it protects your living room, say, from the afternoon sun. Of course, we want to keep it 10 feet away from the house. We don't want to provide a fire hazard by planting more trees. But trees can be part of an energy saving solution. They also provide shade underneath of them, so they keep the ground moisture in their vicinity. And trees, tree cover, plant cover and tree cover especially has been shown to cool the environment, especially in more urban types of locations. So that's another great impact of trees on the environment around us. So the number 2 recommendation for helping gardeners contribute to climate change mitigation is to reduce our water use. And many of you might not realize that water has a really significant carbon footprint. It takes a lot of energy to extract water from whether it's a reservoir or an underground, and to make it clean, distribute it to our faucets. And so every time we conserve water, we are reducing energy consumption. And in California, water is the energy input that's going into water is mostly electricity. And in some places, that's clean electricity that is generated with renewable inputs, but not always. And in addition to that, water is a scarce resource. And that has been brought home to us, particularly right now, because both Marin Municipal Water District and North Marin Water District are considering water restriction measures to all of us who live here in Marin who are not on our own, who are not on private wells. And we are in an exceptionally low rainfall year, as you all know, this year. And so we're in a situation where we need to control our water use in as many ways as we can. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't keep your plants watered. You should. And we'll talk about this more next Saturday in part 2 of the talk, some more strategies for using less water in the garden. But suffice it to say right for now that we need to try to use the most efficient means of irrigation that we can, drip irrigation, apply mulch to keep as much moisture in the soil as we can, and to water deeply and less frequently. That promotes strong root growth, deeper root growth. The more deeply you water and the less frequently you water, the healthier your plant is going to be, because it's going to be sending down its roots in search of more water. We live naturally in a summer dry, winter wet climate. That's our Mediterranean climate. That is getting even more pronounced with climate change and with the prospect of drought. The summer dry part of our climate is getting longer. So if we garden with plants that are native to California or that are native to other Mediterranean regions of the world, that is a good strategy for having plants that are adapted to our climate. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to keep the water that falls as rain, we want to keep it on our land. And we can do this if you have the type of land that's amenable to creating, you have low spots in your yard where you can kind of collect runoff and have a garden that likes a little bit more moisture, by making sure that your patios and pathways are porous. That will ensure that the land that falls on, that the rain that falls on your land stays on your land. You can also harvest the rain that falls with tanks or barrels. Every little bit helps. Are there questions before I move on from water, Barbara?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. So strategy number 3 is to become an edibles gardener. And this is my personal favorite because I am a passionate food gardener. And but I want to help you understand why growing your own food is part of the climate change solution. First of all, when you can grow your own food using sustainable methods, using organic methods or low pesticide, water conserving methods, use compost instead of synthetic fertilizers, that requires less energy inputs probably than much of the food that we buy from the store. It also doesn't have to be transported and refrigerated from a farm, whatever distance away, whether it's, in Southern California, strawberries coming in right now, or whether it's, strawberries from South America. So local food, either from your own garden or locally grown from farmers in the area, has a smaller carbon footprint because it doesn't have that transport and storage energy use. The other thing about growing your own food is that when you produce it yourself, it becomes extremely appealing to eat a more plant-based diet, especially for kids. Well, I would say adults too, but kids get really excited about food that's produced in their own school or in their own yard. And a plant-centric diet has a lower carbon footprint. The more plants in your diet, the lower the carbon footprint of your diet is going to be. So growing your own food has a contribution to climate change mitigation. The next strategy that I want to talk about is being really aware of how we care for our plants. And that is to reduce the amount of fossil fuel inputs that our garden requires by using hand tools when we can. If we don't have a job that a hand tool can do, choose an electric tool rather than a gas-powered tool. And that's for our tasks like pruning and trimming and mowing. So all of those reduce fossil fuel use and help to mitigate climate change. The next thing that we should be doing is avoiding chemical pesticides and chemical fertilizers. Both of these are produced from fossil fuel inputs. And so if we're using more naturally derived fertilizers, mineral fertilizers, if we're using compost or other organic soil amendments, that's a more sustainable approach and doesn't contribute to climate change. If you're a food gardener, something that you can do in the winter is to plant cover crops. If you have beds that are not used, either in the winter or in any particular season, you want to remember, we said earlier, we want to try to reduce the amount of soil that's kept bare because of erosion possibilities, because of changes to soil structure. And so keeping soil planted with cover crops helps reduce that potential for erosion and soil structure changes. And runoff helps reduce the potential for runoff during extreme rains. The other thing that cover crops do, if they're cover crops from the legume family, is they actually add nitrogen to the soil. So that means that when you get ready to plant your garden in the springtime, say you do a winter cover crop of, say, fava beans or of vetch or bell beans, something along those lines, clover, you come in the spring and your garden has, your soil has extra nitrogen in it, ready to help feed the plants that you're going to be planting that spring. I also want to say a word about peat moss. And peat moss, you might know, is mined from carbon bogs. And when peat moss takes eons to form in carbon bogs. And when it is mined, the carbon, there are serious carbon emissions emitted to the atmosphere. And so for two reasons, it would be a good idea to decrease your use of peat moss. Number one, because of the carbon emitted when peat moss is mined. And number two, because it's not a sustainable resource. It will take eons more for the current plants to decompose and get compressed under pressure to form carbon bogs. And so when, for example, when you're looking for potting mixes, try to find a potting mix that doesn't have peat moss as one of the ingredients, and look instead for potting mixes with other kinds of materials in them that help the potting mix hold water. Like, for example, like a new one that's getting a lot more attention these days is coconut coir, which is a renewable resource. I'm going to move on from carbon conscious plant care. And Barbara, do we have questions?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. So the next thing we can do to help mitigate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is to keep our plant waste and our food waste out of the landfill. And I'll talk about plant waste first. Plant waste should go in your green bin, or if you have the space for a compost pile on your property, on your own compost pile. If you're composting your own plant and food waste, that is giving you a green input for your next gardening cycle once your compost breaks down. The same thing with food waste. And one pretty drastic statistic that Barbara and I came across when we were researching for this talk is that food waste accounts for about 22% of the material by weight that goes into our landfills. The reason that this is a problem is that if you've ever seen how a landfill works, the garbage trucks dump the refuse and then it gets covered by a layer of dirt. And what this means is that the material, the garbage that's decomposing, is decomposing under conditions without oxygen, anaerobically. And chemically, this produces methane. And methane is a very, very strong greenhouse gas. It has a much more powerful impact on global warming even than carbon dioxide. So we want to try to prevent landfills from being filled with organic matter, which is going to decompose and contribute methane to the atmosphere, pollute the atmosphere with methane. And so plant waste, food waste goes in your green bin or on your compost pile. And those of you who think it's icky to put food waste in particular in your green bin, who are worried about it getting kind of all messed up, you can just take several layers of newspaper and wrap up your food waste, wrap up the contents of your compost bucket and put that in your green bin so that it doesn't make a mess in your bin. If you have leaves that fall on your land, it's good to just leave them in place and let them decompose. They serve as mulch and help keep moisture in the soil. Or you can run a mower over them if you have a mower, or you can chop them up somehow and they'll degrade even faster into good, rich mulch for your property. If you have a lawn, you'll want to leave the grass clippings in place on your lawn because they help add nitrogen to your lawn and help keep it healthier. So in summary, we talked about 5 strategies to mitigate climate change. We talked about farming carbon by building up the organic content in your soil and by keeping your land productive with plants. We talked about farming carbon in particular by planting trees and shrubs, which are going to store carbon. We talked about conserving water as a really key strategy for saving energy, and it's going to also be an extremely key strategy for adapting to climate change that we'll talk about some more next week. We talked about edibles gardening as an approach that is sustainable and climate friendly. And we talked about carbon conscious plant care techniques. And we talked about managing our waste from plants and food, any kind of organic waste, by keeping it out of the garbage and leaving it in the landfill. In wrapping up, I want to talk about how climate smart gardening is pretty much synonymous with earth-friendly gardening. We all want to adopt practices in our gardens that are earth friendly, that help protect our natural resources, that help boost biodiversity in the face of declining biodiversity that climate change is bringing. And we want to minimize the waste that comes out of our gardens and the pollutants that we use, the materials we use as inputs that can pollute the air and the water and the soil. And we want to do all of this also with an eye to reducing carbon emissions. And so the 4 principles of climate smart gardening that go really hand in hand with earth-friendly best practices are nurturing the soil, which we talked about. We'll talk more next Saturday about encouraging biodiversity, using our own yards, our own land to help protect some of the, or prevent some of the biodiversity threats, or counterbalance some of the biodiversity threats that climate change is putting on our open spaces. Of course, we've just focused on mitigating climate change here. And when we have a healthy garden, we're also protecting wildlife and the environment by creating habitat and avoiding toxic inputs. And so with that, I'll spend just a minute showing you some of the references here. And if you have questions, please type them into the chat and we'll talk for a few minutes about any questions you have. And I'm going to leave up this slide about how to get in touch with master gardeners in a variety of ways while we talk about questions.
So we have a good question. This is from David. He wants to know if home compost piles produce methane, and if there are strategies of care that could reduce the amount of home produced methane.
That is an amazingly insightful question.
Yeah.
Because many home compost piles don't get very hot. And a good warm compost pile doesn't produce much methane, but a cold compost pile that takes, like, if it takes 1.5 years for your compost pile to break down, then it's probably producing some methane. So some strategies to make your compost pile hotter are to make sure that you have a good mix of what we call greens and browns. The greens are food waste and fresh plant material. The browns are things like newspapers, sawdust, dried out plant material. And when you have a good mix of greens and browns, your compost pile is going to decompose more effectively. The larger your compost pile is, the more chance it has of getting warm. And I think the guideline that I remember is at least 3 by 3 by 3 feet, so 3 cubic feet, to have a chance of building up some warmth. And then to turn it on a regular basis, get out your pitchfork and just, turn it over a bit. And if it dries out, to give it a little water. Compost piles like to be moist, not soggy, but kind of damp. Barbara, do you have more to say about compost?
No, I would say that if you don't feel that you can create that kind of a compost, an active compost, then it would be better to put food in the green bin, I think. Food waste in the green bin.
Or a worm bin.
Or a worm bin, absolutely. But I have a kind of follow-on question that came to my mind. When we talk about landfill and anaerobic conditions in the landfill from putting food waste and then covering it, it made me think about one strategy for composting your food waste is to dig a hole and put the food waste in it and then cover it. Wouldn't that be anaerobic?
Yes, but I've seen it promoted as a good composting practice. So
I have too.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
That's one we're going to have to look up.
We're going to have to do a little bit more research on that.
Yeah.
We've stumped ourselves, Barbara. Yeah. Are there any more questions out there?
There aren't. No more questions.
Okay. Well, you see here on this slide that there are a number of ways that master gardeners can be of assistance. We have a help desk. It's based at our office in Novato, the UC Cooperative Extension office. However, our office has been closed for the past year, and we're taking help desk inquiries via email. And that's the way that's most effective to get them to us these days. You can also phone if you need help. We have a free newsletter, an e-newsletter, and if you snap a photo of this graphic image here on the screen, that'll sign you up for our newsletter. We have a program called Garden Walks, where 2 master gardeners come to your home, focusing on your watering practices, and they'll give you advice on how to adopt a more sustainable, water efficient landscape, and talk with you about plant choices. And it's the only program we have where we go out to people's homes, and we haven't been doing water walks for several months now, but we're starting to get back into the field. So if you're interested in that, you can call our help desk. So with that, we want to thank you. Get out there on this beautiful day and pull some weeds. I know that's what I'm going to be doing.
And don't forget that everybody, this was part 1. So if you haven't signed up for part 2, which will be next Saturday with Kathy and Barbara. So I'll send that out in the follow-up email as well. So make sure you keep an eye out for the email with our survey. And again, thank you, Kathy and Barbara, for sharing this with us today. And we'll see you guys next time.
You're so welcome. It was our pleasure.
Yes. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.